All right, Mr. Trutna, here we go. We're going to get started on the quadratic formula. So you can see this so-so looking actor here saying the only reason I know the quadratic formula is that awesome song you sing to Pop Goes the Weasel. See? So ladies, singing that song may pay off someday. You might meet whatever his name is. Ryan Reynolds, I don't know, Bruce Willis, whoever that guy is. Okay. So we're going to be going over Worksheet 4. This is Mr. Trutna from Clovis High School. And we're going to be going over numbers 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And if you notice, the instructions to the problem say, solve the quadratic formula, leave your answer in simplest radical form. All right, so in number 2, we have the equation 3m to the second power is equal to 4 minus 6m. Let me zoom this in a little bit so that we could make it out a little bit easier. Okay. So, remember you guys, I've taken the liberty of already writing down the quadratic formula, which is x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. See, Pop goes the weasel right there. So, remember though, before we use the quadratic formula, never try to use the quadratic formula until the problem is actually equal to 0. So in number 2 right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract negative 3m squared from both sides of the equation. So I'm going to just take away 3m squared from both sides of the equation. Why am I going to do that? Well, because those 3m squareds will cancel out, and then I will have a problem now that is equal to 0. Okay, and then I'm just going to write this problem in standard order. So I'm going to write it as negative 3m squared, then minus 6m, and then plus 4. Notice the problem is now equal to 0. Once you have the problem equal to 0, then you could identify your a value, your b value, and your c value. So your a value is going to be the number in front of the squared part, so this would be negative 3. Your b value would be the number in front of the m part, which we call the linear term, so that would be negative 6. And then your c value will be your constant. It's the number that has no variable next to it, an m squared or an m. So your c value in this case would be 4. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to take negative 3, negative 6, and 4, and we're just going to substitute those values into my equation. So when I do that, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to draw it over here, I'm going to get x equals, now the formula here says negative b. So as a mathematician, the way you read that is, you read that as the opposite of whatever b is. So b we have here is negative 6. So when I put that into my formula, it becomes positive 6. Why positive 6? What's the opposite of negative 6? Positive 6. That's what negative b means. Put the opposite of whatever you say b is. Then we put the plus minus symbol. Then we put a square root. Then we're going to have b squared. That's going to be negative 6 squared minus 4 times a is negative 3, times c is positive 4. And then I'm going to divide all of that by 2 times a, and once again, a is negative 3. Please notice that with the exception at the very beginning, every time I inputted or substituted a number in the place of a variable, b, a, or c, I always put that number in parentheses. Always a good idea. Okay, so now I'm going to solve this problem. So I'm going to get x equals 6 plus or minus, and when we solve the problem, the first thing you want to do is you want to work out what's inside the parentheses. Okay, so what is negative 6 squared? That's 36. And then we're going to have a minus. So when I work this out, I'm just going to put it over here so you can see it, or I'll put it down here. You're going to have a 36, and then we're going to have a minus, and then I'm going to go 4 times negative 3, that's negative 12, times 4, so that would be negative 48. So I'm going to get 36 minus negative 48. And then I'm going to divide all of that by negative 6. Okay? Still working out the parentheses, and I'll have to move my answer or my work up here. I would get x equals positive 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus negative 48. That's going to become a double plus, so that's going to be 84. And then I'm going to divide all of that by negative 6. Okay, so at this point when we're working out the problem, if if that number right here, your square root, if it's not a perfect square, then we're going to have to put that in simplest radical form. Okay, so what does that mean? It means I'm going to have to take the number 84 and I'm going to factor it. Okay, so 84 is 7 times 12. 12 is 4 times 3. And then 4 is 2 times 2. So you can see that my factors, or 84, are 7 and 2 and 2 and 3. And I have an identical pair of 2's. So that means when I simplify this, I get x equals 6 plus or minus, and then I'm going to have a 2 and then a square root, because the 2's, because they're identical, will move to the outside. And then notice I have a 7 times 3 left over, so I have a 21. And then I'm going to divide that by negative 6. Okay, so at this point, you're done with your problem. That would be your answer. Okay, and there's only one exception to that rule. If what you do is you look at all three of the numbers on the outside here, which are 6 and 2 and negative 6. Can we reduce all of these? All right, so in other words, is there a number that I can divide into all three of these numbers? Absolutely, a 2. So I can reduce all of these numbers by dividing by 2. And what that does is that gives me my final answer of 6 divided by 2 is 3. Plus or minus, 2 divided by 2 is 1, so I don't have to write a 1. And I have a square root of 21 though. All over negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. So that would be my answer for number 2. Okay, x is equal to 3 plus the square root of 21 divided by negative 3. It's also equal to 3 minus the square root of 21 divided by negative 3. Okay, moving on to number 4. You can see that I've already taken the liberty of writing the equation down. Every time you do a quadratic formula equation, you want to write the equation. Okay, the reason is because if you write it enough, you'll just naturally remember the equation. And knowing the equation is going to help you out on the test. You'll do better on the test by having the quadratic formula memorized than not. Okay, so number 4, 2x squared plus 3x minus 7 is equal to 0. Notice this problem is already equal to 0. So that means I can now identify my a, my b, and my c value. So my a value is going to be 2. That's the coefficient in front of the x squared. My b value is always the coefficient in front of the x, which is positive 3, so I just say 3. And then my c value is always the number that has no variable next to it, an x squared or an x, and that's a minus 7. So my c value is negative 7. All right, so what do I do now after I have that? Well, I'm going to use my formula, and I'm going to substitute 2, 3, and negative 7 in the place of a, b, and c in my formula. So when I do that, I get, I'm going to do this one in red, so we kind of contrast by color. So I get x equals, and then I have negative b. So once again, what does that mean? Negative b to a math person. That means put the opposite of what you say b is. We say b is 3, so we put negative 3 here, because that's the opposite of 3. Plus minus, and then I'm going to do the square root. Okay, b squared, so I'm going to have 3 squared. Notice I'm putting the numbers in parentheses as I substitute them in. Minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 7. And then I'm going to divide all of that, so all of that's going to be under 2 times a, which is going to be 2 times 2. All right, and now I'm ready to solve this equation. In other words, I'm going to work it out. So when we work this problem out, when we solve it, remember the first thing you always solve is the inside of the square root part. So 3 squared is 9. Then I put a minus sign, and then I multiply these three numbers out. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times negative 7 is negative 56. So I get 7 minus negative 56. And then I'm going to divide that, and I can go ahead and multiply out the denominator, so that's 4. Okay, what's 9 minus negative 56 equal to? And I'll write it over here. So now my formula becomes, my quadratic formula becomes negative 3 plus or minus the square root. 9 minus negative 56 is 65. And then I'm going to put that all over 4. Okay? So once I work out the inside of the square root, then I find the square root of 65. Is 65 a perfect square number. No, it is not. So I have to factor 65 down to see if I can simplify the square root of 65. So 65 is 5 times, let's see, what would that be, 13? Okay, and you can't factor 5 anymore. You can't factor 13 anymore. They're prime, so I cannot get an identical pair of numbers. So what that tells me is this answer cannot be simplified. So therefore, that's the answer to number 4. Right there, you can stop. Okay, you can't simplify the square root of 65, and there's no fractions that you could reduce by dividing, so my answer is x is equal to -3 plus the square root of 65 over 4, and -3 minus the square root of 65 over 4. Weird looking answer, but that's what it is. Okay, number 6. Notice in number 6, I've already taken the liberty of writing down the quadratic formula. You always want to write down the quadratic formula, okay? So then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to identify my A value, my B value, and my C value. But if you notice, number 6 is not equal to 0. Do not identify A, B, and C for the quadratic formula until you have the problem equal to 0. So I'm going to zero out this side. So that's a positive 2m, so I'm going to subtract 2m. And I'm going to subtract 2m right there as well. Okay, so watch what happens when I do that. I get a 2m squared. Then I get a minus 3m minus 2m, so that gives me minus 5m. Then I get a plus 1. And then I get an equals. What's that equal to? That's 0. So notice I have manipulated my problem by subtracting 2m from both sides. Now I've made the problem, this quadratic equation, I made the equation equal to 0. Now I can identify A, B, and C to use the quadratic formula. Okay, so what's the A value? 2. The A value is always the number or the coefficient in front of the squared part, m squared. What's your B value? -5. What's your C value? +1. Okay, so once I have that, I'm now going to substitute 2 and -5 and 1 into my quadratic formula. All right, so doing that, I'm going to get x equals -b. What does that mean? It means the opposite of b. We said b was -5. What's the opposite of -5? That's +5. So I put a +5. Plus or minus square root, and now from this point on, every time I put a number in the place of a variable, A or C or B, I'm going to put it in parentheses. So I'm going to get -5 squared minus 4 times A is 2, times C is 1, and then I'm going to divide all of that by 2 times A, and A is 2. Okay, so I substitute my A, B, and C into my quadratic formula. Okay, next, as I continue to solve this, remember, as we solve it, the next thing you always do is you work out the inside of the square root symbol, or the radical symbol. So -5 squared is 25. Then we put a minus sign, and then we multiply these three numbers out. 4 times 2 times 1 is 8. So I get 25 minus 8. And then I'm going to put that all over. I'm going to divide it all by 2 times 2. That is 4. Okay, simplifying the inside of the square root, I'm going to get x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 17. And then I'm going to put that all over 4. Okay, now I evaluate the square root of 17. Is 17 a perfect square root? No, it's not. Okay, so then what do? Well, I try to simplify. Problem is, when you try to factor down 17, there's no factors of 17. So that's a prime number. So what does that tell me? That's my answer. So number 6, the answer is x is equal to 5 plus the square root of 17 all over 4. It's also 5 minus the square root of 17 all over 4. Okay, once again, a weird looking answer, but that's the answer to number 6. Okay, moving on to number 8. You will notice once again, I have taken the liberty of writing down the quadratic formula. Okay, the more you write it down, the better chance you have of remembering it. You're going to get a better grade on the test if you remember the quadratic formula. There goes the lights. That also happens if you don't remember the quadratic formula. Just kidding. A, B, C. I'm going to identify what my A, B, and C are. I look at my equation. Is it equal to 0? No. It's equal to 14. I can't say what A, B, and C are yet. So I have to zero out this 14 side. So I'm going to minus 14 from both sides. Subtract 14. Okay? Now, why do I do that? Watch what happens. I get x squared minus 9x. Positive 20 minus 14 is positive 6 equals 14 minus 14 is 0. So notice, I now have my equation equal to 0. I can now say what my a value is. What's my a value? It's the number before the x squared. There's no number in front of the x squared. So what's the number? It's a 1. So if there's no number showing in front of a variable, a letter, a variable, it's a 1. What's my b value? Minus 9. What's my c value? Positive 6. I take my a, my b, my c, I substitute it into the quadratic formula. And I'm going to then solve it to see what my solution is to number 8. So I get x equals, notice my formula says negative b. Negative b means put the opposite of what you said b was. I said b was negative 9, the opposite of that is positive 9. Plus or minus the square root, and now once again, every time I put a number in the place of a variable, a b, an a, or a c, I'm going to put it in parentheses. So I'm going to get b squared. That's negative 9 squared. Minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 6. And then I'm going to divide that entire thing, or put that entire part over 2 times a, which would be 2 times 1. Okay, so now I work this out. So remember, as we simplify, the first part you always do is you always simplify the inside of the square root. Negative 9 squared is 81. Then I put a minus sign, and then I multiply these three numbers out. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 6 is 24. So I'm going to get 81 minus 24, and that's all going to be divided by all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Simplifying that problem out further, I get x is equal to 9 plus or minus the square root, and then 81 minus 24 is 57. So I'm going to get the square root of 57. And then that's going to be all over 2. Okay? Now I evaluate the square root of 57. Is 57 a perfect square root number? No, it is not. So then I have to make a factor tree of 57 to see if I can put it in simplest radical form. The problem is 57, there's no two numbers that multiply to make 57. So that tells me that's a prime number. So what does that tell me? It tells me that this is my answer. So number 8, the solution was 9 plus or minus the square root of 57 all over, or all divided by 2. So 9 plus the square root of 57 over 2, 9 minus square root of 57 over 2. That would be my answer. Okay, moving on to the last problem that I assign you, number 10. Notice I've already written down the quadratic formula. So now I'm going to identify my a value, my b value, and my c value. Okay, all right, look at the equation. 2x squared plus 4x plus 5 is equal to 0. It's equal to 0. So that means since the equation is equal to 0, I can identify a, b, and c. A is 2, the number in front of the x squared. We call that the coefficient. B is 4, the number or the coefficient in front of the x. C is positive 5. C is called the constant. That means it's the number that has no variable next to it. Now I'm going to substitute 2, 4, and 5 into the quadratic formula. When I do that, my formula becomes x equals, and then I get negative b. Once again, what does that mean? It means the opposite of b. We said b was 4. The opposite of 4 is negative 4. Plus or minus the square root, and now I'm going to put all my numbers in parentheses that I'm replacing in the place of the variables. So I'm going to get 4 squared, which was b squared, minus 4 times a is 2, times c is 5, and then I'm going to put that all over, or I'm going to divide it all by 2 times a, and a is 2, so 2 times 2. Now I continue to solve this formula. Alright, so I'm going to get negative 4 plus or minus, and remember when you solve the formula you always work out the inside of the square root first. 4 squared is 16. I put a minus sign, and then I multiply these three numbers together. 4 times 2 is 8, 8 times 5 is 40. So I'm going to get minus 16 minus 40. And then I'm going to divide or put that all over 4. My denominator is going to be 4. Okay? Now I'm going to continue to work this out. I'm going to simplify out the square root symbol. So I'm going to get x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus the square root. 16 minus 40 is negative 24. And then I'm going to divide that all by positive 4. Alrighty, so now square root of negative 24. What do I do with that? Okay, well, first of all, I have a square root of a negative number. So what does that tell me? It tells me my answer is going to be an imaginary answer. So how do I simplify the square root of negative 24? Watch. So I'll do it over here so you can see how to do it. So I take the square root of positive 24 and I multiply it by the square root of negative 1. This is what we do when we have square roots of negatives. Now notice, is 24 times negative 1 negative 24? Yeah, that works out. Okay, so now what am I going to do? Well, I know that the square root of negative 1 is I, by definition, and then what do I do with 24? Well, I make a factor tree out of 24. So 24 is 6 times 4, 6 is 3 times 2, 4 is 2 times 2. So you could see that I have an identical pair of 2's. So what does 24 simplify into? Those 2's, remember, to go to the outside. That would be 2 square root of 6. Then I have times I. So here's how I write that. So now, simplifying my answer, I'm going to have x equals negative 4 plus minus, and the square root of negative 24 becomes 2i squared root of 6. 2i squared root of 6. Why did I write the I next to the 2? Well, the I is not inside the square root symbol, so I move it next to the 2, so everybody knows the I is outside the square root symbol. Okay, then I'm going to divide all of that by 4. Okay, so that's your answer. Okay, unless, remember, there's always that unless. So, unless you can simplify all three of these numbers. Is there a number that divides into negative 4 and 2 and 4? The answer is yes, it's 2. So I'm going to divide all of these numbers here by 2 just to simplify my answer. So when I do that, I'm going to run out of room probably, but I'll try to squeeze it in way at the bottom here. I'm going to get x equals negative 4 divided by 2, that's negative 2, plus minus 2 divided by 2 is 1, and I have an I, so that's 1i. That's just I. Square root of 6. All over 4 divided by 2 is 2. So that would be my answer to number 10. Okay, see you next time.